Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for spending your evening or afternoon with us, depending where you are on the planet. My name is Brian Nitzel, and I would imagine that many of you came to this call probably because you were interested in the topic, or more likely were interested in hearing from Justin or Gregory, and certainly not me. So in case you don't know anything about, which is as it should be, but if you don't know anything about me and my organization, I thought I'd just kind of give you a little context before we get started. So Making Things Right is my organization. The mission is to rethink the Christian response and responsibility to LGBTQ plus people, especially those who have been harmed from the church. There's an important study that I and others in this work reference frequently that found that 86% of LGBTQ plus people were raised in the church. And of those, over half, 54% left at the age of consent or around the age of 18. And the number one stated reason was negative, harmful experiences. And I think that is what the Christian conversation should be about. And I think that's what we can help make right. And the beauty of that, which is the spirit of tonight's call, is we can do that amidst theological differences because this is common ground work. MTR Connect, which you're on tonight, began just kind of naturally a couple of years ago, just gathering of curious Christians. Our goal is to learn from each other and encourage and equip you and your family, your church, your community, or wherever you find yourself. And so if you want to learn more about Making Things Right or the trusted resources and ministry partners that we work with, you can check that out at makingthingsright.org. Okay, so there's my Making Things Right commercial. The plan for tonight, I'm going to give a little update on my organization about a really cool thing that Kelly and I did last weekend with some friends. Then I'm going to set up the conversation for tonight. I'm going to introduce my lovely guests. We're going to have a conversation. We planned some topics that we think will serve you. We love that when you registered, I think we forced you to do this, sorry, but it says, what do you hope for in this call? And many of you said some wonderful things where we're able to stitch together some themes to help inform our discussion. So we hope that will serve you well. But we always try to find time to carve out time for Q&A. We never get to all of them. I apologize in advance. But my friend Kelly here is going to kind of watch the chat along the way. And when we start getting a little more towards the end of the time tonight, I'll ask her to maybe curate out a couple of questions from the chat. Right. And then we'll wrap right around 8:45 Eastern time or wherever you find yourself, which is about a little over an hour and 10 minutes from now. So that's the plan for tonight. For Q&A, if you're not super Zoom friendly, somewhere towards the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to open a chat window and you can chat as you go. And then as questions arise that you would like answered, you can type those in the chat. And then one final housekeeping item is respect. I always like to mention this. All of us, I'm sure, are here for the best of intentions, but we're talking about LGBTQ plus and Christian matters. These are spicy subjects. And so sometimes people don't have the best of intentions. So Kelly is the bouncer. Anyway, she follows the screens and the chats to just make sure that there's only productive, collaborative things going on. And that's really just for the sake of all of you who are here for the best of intentions. And we do reserve the right to remove folks as needed. Okay, so that's it for housekeeping. I would love to give you a quick update on my organization. And if you follow us on Instagram, you probably saw this as our post kind of blew up this weekend, which was fun. But last Sunday, Kelly, if you raise your hand, Kelly. Kelly's my partner in crime. She runs marketing for Making Things Right. And Kelly and I and a small band of crazy Christians headed down to the Atlanta Pride Parade, over 100,000 people, to simply say, I'm sorry on behalf of fellow believers who have not loved LGBTQ plus people well. We got there early, got a really great pole position right at the right spot of the parade. Thousands of people probably saw our little cruise signs, saying what we were sorry for and our matching shirts. My favorite memory of the whole night, or excuse me, of the whole day had to be when Kelly's like, oh, let me get your picture over here. And we went down and snapped a picture of me in front of a big group of protesters with big signs about how everybody's going to hell and they need to repent, with me and my little sign. Let me show you my sign. And I was just like, so many hugs and tears and thank yous just reminded me how powerful, powerful that simple and intentional acts of compassion can be. If I could put you on the spot, Kelly, like, could you give us some reflections of Sunday?
I've told Brian, we've talked about this a couple times, but I am still on a cloud. Like, I don't know how you guys feel if you go to an event that moves you so much, and then after you're just on this emotional high, like your adrenaline's high, your brain's just 90 miles an hour, your heart just feels full, and I still feel very much like that. It was really cool to see in the parade as participants or even spectators would walk by us, notice Brian's sign, notice our shirts, and you could just see visually they were moved. And to me, that meant everything because that's what we were there to do. We gave out hugs. We talked to people. We loved on people.
So many conversations. Oh my gosh.
So many, and people just stopping to take our picture. So Brian's holding the sign, and I'm giving the love, and it was so phenomenal that I literally haven't stopped talking about it, and I'm already looking forward to next year. So yeah, it was.
And we had six other people with us, I think, or five. They had two other signs. Their messages were a little different. Mine was a little, I don't think it was crass, but my teenage daughters made me help me make it the night before, and they especially encouraged the badass part of the sign. The other signs were, had their own messages of what they were sorry for, but it was pretty memorable. Yeah.
It was phenomenal. I can't wait to do it again. And I would encourage everybody, if you get a chance to go to Pride with, a Pride event in your area, and just be there as that loving, apologetic presence. It's powerful.
Cool. So there's an update on making things right. Let's pivot to the conversation tonight, if we and let me set up the conversation a little bit, if I may. So sides A, B, X, and Y. What the heck are all of those? Here's my best attempt. Side A believes that same-sex relationships and marriages are good, biblically permissible, and can be blessed by God. Side B believes more traditionally that that marriage is reserved for one man, one woman, and yet fully affirms the goodness of LGBTQ plus people in their diversity, in sexual orientation and gender identity, and believes that God does too. Side X would not only reject same-sex relationships like side B, but also LGBTQ plus identities, calling that broken and something to be repaired and reoriented. And then side Y, a nuanced side, would also reject LGBTQ plus identification and relationships like side X, yet not necessarily encourage orientation change or work, but rather focus more on general holiness and regeneration as Christians. And all these sides represent how we as Christians differ in our beliefs as it relates to matters of sexuality and identity. But what are the common threads? Or rather, what is the common ground work that might be exponentially successful if we agreed to disagree and rallied around indisputably good things like healing and reconciliation with God and with each other? That's stuff that I'm pretty passionate about. And so tonight we're going to explore that together. And in my work, I think it's rare to find folks on different sides of the theological aisle, if you will, who are eager to get in the same room and roll up our sleeves together. And thankfully tonight, I'm joined by a couple shining exceptions of that. So let me introduce my two speakers for the night, and we'll get started. First, Justin Lee, leading voice for over 25 years in this conversation. Go-to thought leader known for building bridges across areas of theological disagreement, author of the widely cited and popular book Torn, and a lesser known yet highly relevant book to this discussion, Talking Across the Divides. And then my good friend Greg Coles, newer friend, not new anymore, but newer, PhD scholar and author with numerous academic articles and 3 books, I believe. Perhaps the most popular, his award-winning book, Single, Gay, and Christian. As regular speaker, including with the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, which is a leading organization that serves more traditional churches seeking to create safe and compassionate environments for LGBTQ plus people. So Justin and Greg, welcome. So good to have you tonight.
Thanks for having us. Fun to be here.
Thanks. Yeah.
So let's, before we dive into theology and stuff, let's just get to know you a little bit. And maybe, Gregory, let's start with you if you don't mind. Like, just tell us about home, family, church, what you're doing, aspiring to do, any recent good work you've been up to or you're excited about. We'd just like to learn a little bit about you and what you're up to.
Yeah, so I currently live in Boise, Idaho. I've been here about 3 years. Prior to that, I was in Pennsylvania most recently, but I grew up in Indonesia. So really from is a fluid concept for me. I'm part of a sweet little church community here, a relatively recent church plant that is part of the Evangelical Covenant Church denomination, which is a denomination I love. And our church in Boise has the distinction of being the only such church in the whole state of Idaho. And if you knew the nature of the Evangelical Covenant Church and the nature of Idaho, that fact would not surprise you. For work, I spend part of my time working with the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. And then the rest of my time, I freelance as a writer and speaker and editor. And one of the exciting things I've been up to is actually just, what day was it? Last Friday, I think, signed a contract for a new book project, which will be a co-authored project with myself and a Catholic friend. The two of us dialoguing about the question of what purpose human sexuality serves apart from sex itself. Which is a question of some interest to me as a person who's celibate and plans on staying that way, but also for my straight married female Catholic friend, an interesting question for her in its own way. So I'm excited for what the two of us will unpack. But it'll be we still have to write most of that book, so don't get too excited too quickly. But I'm pretty stoked about it.
That's awesome. Cool. I love it. Justin, how about you?
Well, let's see. I'm happy to be here. And
happy to have you.
So I got married a couple years ago, so that's been a big change in my life after many years of talking about marriage and all of this stuff to get married has been cool. And the biggest things right now, my first book, Torn, we just came out with a new edition of that this year.
That's right.
So
because the original one was about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, ish. Yeah. And so this new one, it's got a new cover. It's got a cross on the cover. You can see what it looks like on my website. My website is geekyjustin.com because I'm a big geek, as you can probably tell from some of the stuff on the shelves behind me. Yeah, so I had been wanting to update Torn for a very long time, for a number of reasons, and I won't, waste our time by getting into all that now, but I made a video. You can see it on my YouTube channel, where I talk about that. It's linked from my website. But essentially wanted to update, some of the conversation. And so I'm excited. It's got new chapters. It's got 4 new chapters and a lot of updates all throughout. So that was a lot of work. And then have just done some minor updates to my second book, Talking Across the Divide. And so the updated edition, which I think is not being marketed as an updated edition because it's really minor updates, but that's coming out early next year. And working for my nonprofit Nuance, and then also,
right.
Yeah, Nuance Ministries, and then also making videos on YouTube and doing a lot of speaking. And you can find my YouTube channel at youtube.com/geekyjustin. So that's what I'm up to right now.
Yeah. And where do you live?
Oh, I'm in Charlotte now.
Okay. Charlotte. That's right. I wasn't sure. For some reason, I thought you were in Nashville, but I knew that was wrong. So are you hit by Helene in Charlotte or no?
No, but I have family that was affected. So I have certainly been following that very closely.
Cool. Good. Well, thank you. Let's so the first question we had planned was just learning about you both theologically, I guess, or just from a belief perspective. And maybe I'll start with you, Justin, if you don't mind. But like, what's your story or path to land where you are today theologically, whether that be side A or side B? And if it makes sense, how have your views evolved along the way?
Yeah. So I'll confess, and I know we'll get to this, so I won't say more about this than this, but I confess that some of the side language you just said at the beginning of this call is new to me, even.
Yeah.
So for others, you're not alone. But the very brief version of my story is I grew up with a very traditional, you might say, view, what I'd now call a side B view, that doesn't allow for same-sex marriage, that marriage should be between a man and a woman, sex is for marriage, and therefore any kind of homosexual activity is forbidden, was, the view that I had growing up. And I believed more than that. I believed that gay people chose to be gay, that it was a sin, a sinful choice, that God had something better for them, and didn't realize until I was 18 that I was gay. And
Hmm.
at that point, really had to wrestle with everything because I had thought people chose to be gay. I didn't fully understand growing up that the word gay just referred to people's attractions. I thought it referred to
Hmm.
some kinds of, life choices people made, and those were choices I hadn't made. And so I realized that there was a lot about all of this I didn't understand, and I had to decide, what about the rest of this? Do I still think that same-sex marriage is wrong? Do I think that there's a room for that? Um, and long story short, after years of Bible study and prayer, came to the conclusion that, although if God called me to celibacy, and if I believed that was what God required, I was willing to be celibate. After years of Bible study, I came to the conclusion that that wasn't a requirement. And that put me, of course, on the other side of this from most of the people I knew, because my whole
Yeah.
world was a conservative evangelical world. And so I met in those early years a lot of other gay Christians who were in a similar boat. Folks who, some of them had come to the conclusion that God blessed same-sex marriage. Some of them had come to the conclusion that Greg has, that's not what God desires, that God calls gay people to celibacy. But all of us had experienced um, a lot of hurt and a lot of pain in our journeys from Christians who didn't understand what we were going through. And
Mhm.
so uh, we got together, and I started an online community that I ran for a number of years, and have basically ever since been out there working to try and um, change the way that Christians approach this. But critically, this is the last thing I'll say about this. For me, the goal has never been change people's theological view on marriage. Obviously, I want people to agree with me because I think I'm right, but I don't feel like my calling is to go out and change everybody's mind on a particular point of doctrine. What
Mm.
what to me looks like success in my work is if we have empathy for each other, and if we can treat each other with love and compassion and listen to each other and support each other even in cases when we disagree. If we can
Mm.
do that, then I trust the Holy Spirit with the rest.
Mm. I love that. And timeline of when it probably wasn't like a exact particular time, but what was around the time when you had turned the corner and would thought of yourself more as side A, if you would, rather than side B? Was that 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Um Golly, now you're making me do math.
Because it sounded like a while ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be it was more than 20 more than
Yeah.
20 years ago.
So that was
Um
that was long before that was at all in fashion, right?
yeah,
In the Christian
yeah.
circles or no?
Well, yeah, no, that's true. But I mean, I think the reality is in in all of our theological conversations, we're standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, and there are others who stand on our shoulders, and this is part of why we have tradition. This is part of why Christian community is important. So, there were folks having this conversation before I was born. But I think part of why I kind of ended up in the position that I did is I sort of came along at the right time, and I was wrestling with this in the early days of the internet at a time when a lot of people were going online looking for answers, and there just wasn't that much because the internet was fairly new for most of us. So
Sure.
that was the time frame for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I know that we're going to get to it in a little bit, but that you were kind of instrumental in sort of originating the sides A and side B. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Greg, if I would, like, same question to you, like what was your journey that kind of brought you to what your beliefs and theologies are today for yourself, for others, whatever, and have those evolved over time?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian community that was, in many ways, it sounds like similar to Justin's. I think not just with a conviction that marriage was between male and female, but also with the conviction that if you happen to be gay, you just needed to figure out what went wrong in your upbringing and blame your father for being distant and blame your mother for being overbearing, and go to a lot of therapy and love Jesus enough, and then you too could be fruitful and multiply. And so I think so I spent like middle school and high school and college being really dubious of the etiological narratives for what was supposed to have made me gay, but being like, well, if I just pray and love Jesus enough and that makes me straight, I guess that was already on the agenda, so we can go for it and see what happens. And so I did spend a good chunk of my life sort of trying to measure the state of my spiritual growth on the basis of how straight I felt at any given time, which was not advisable. And the crisis point for me really came the year after I finished undergrad, when through a variety of avenues, it became increasingly clear to me that I was in fact not becoming straighter, and that really launched a pretty significant faith crisis for me, because I started to wonder, well, if that part of what I had gained from my Christian community was false, what else of the rest of it might have been false? So I was deconstructing back before it was sexy to deconstruct. So as I started trying to like piece back together my faith, when I came back to the question of like, okay, if I start with the person of Jesus and sort of work from there, like, how do I make sense of these things theologically? I really spent probably a good maybe 2 years doing that sort of narrative journey. And actually, it's funny talking about this with Justin sitting here on the other Zoom square, because Torn was one of the more significant books I read in that journey. So thanks for that, Justin. It's a good one. Recommend it to all of you. So at the end of that process, I came to the somewhat begrudging conclusion that I couldn't find space within my own reading of scripture as it struck my conviction and so forth, space to pursue a same-sex marriage. And so I was like, well, I'm like a solid Kinsey 6. So I guess I'm just going to be celibate then. And kind of the deal I made with God at that point, I was like, I think I'm willing to like give the celibacy thing a shot, as long as you don't make me tell anyone. So my dream was that I would die and no one would realize that I was gay, which obviously has worked out very well for me at this point in my life.
Greg, not to interrupt, but do you want to clarify for folks who aren't familiar what a Kinsey 6 is?
Oh, I would be delighted.
Me included.
So Kinsey was a sexologist who was really obsessed with figuring out how to codify people's experience of attraction, but also sexual behaviors, which is part of why, if you actually look into it, the Kinsey scale is really messy, because technically, if you get somebody who's totally attracted to the same sex, but like kisses and has sex with lots of people of the opposite sex, then Kinsey's like, it's somewhere in the middle then. So it's not a perfect metric, but Kinsey's metric ran from 0, which was like all heterosexual attraction and behavior, no homosexual, to 6. 6 being the top of the scale, the most gay, as it were. This is a good clarification. Thank you, Justin.
I love it. You know what? At the risk of being really inappropriate, I think you're the happiest celibate person I've ever met in my life. But I digress.
Well, huzzah. I think there's much happiness to be found in celibacy, but perhaps that's a different webinar than this one.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And my story is very similar to both of yours too. So thank you. I just wanted to get some context there. That was great. So let's talk about the origin of sides A and side B. We're going to defer to you here a little bit, Justin. I'm sure that Greg and I will have a couple opinions, but you were kind of part of the origin story of these terms. Can you talk about that, and how are they relevant and valuable today, or maybe how and where are they not?
Well, so don't give me credit for originating them, because I didn't have anything to do with originating them, but I did come in not long after. So there was an online discussion group in the late 90s called Bridges Across the Divide, the name of which inspired the title of my book, Talking Across the Divide. And essentially, Bridges Across the Divide was a group of folks who were not all Christians, although many of them were, who disagreed about homosexuality specifically, and were trying to have more empathetic, generous, helpful conversations across that disagreement. And the initial conversation was happening between one person on each side. It was a mom, we would call her now an affirming mom of a lesbian daughter who was fully affirming of her daughter's same-sex relationship, and an ex-gay leader who did not support same-sex, consummated same-sex relationships. And they were trying to talk about, you know, all the ways they disagreed. And as the group having this conversation grew, they were really struggling to find a good way to identify these two positions. Today, a lot of people might call them affirming and non-affirming, but that's still, you know, non-affirming sounds kind of negative. And they were trying to find something that didn't sound negative on either side, that didn't sound political, you know, liberal and conservative didn't sound right. They didn't want to say pro-gay and anti-gay. That sounded wrong. And no term they could come up with felt neutral. And so finally they said, what if we just call them A and B? And we just, you know, and so the position that many people would now call an affirming position, they just called side A, and the non-affirming position they called side B. And critically, the only difference between these two sides was, what is your view of the morality of same-sex sex, essentially?
Just that, right?
Just that.
Yeah.
So if you don't approve of same-sex sex, then you're side B. Whether you support ex-gay movements, don't support ex-gay movements, believe in celibacy, believe God's going to change orientation, whatever, all of that is side B. And if you did believe that there's at least some context in which sexual behavior between two people of the same sex could be acceptable, whether that was because you believed any sex is okay, or whether that's because you believed it's okay within marriage and, you know, whatever, all of that was side A. So they were very broad terms. And within the context of that community, this was helpful to just have that shorthand of A and B. But what started to happen was a lot of people who were in this group started using that terminology in other groups that they were part of. And then people started using the terminology to mean different things. And so, for instance, in a group of gay Christians that I was part of, people started talking about side B in terms of celibacy, because they were all gay Christians. So there were no ex-gay folks there. So side B within that group was celibacy. And so then a lot of people more broadly started talking about side B as celibacy. And then people started talking about side X as those who supported the ex-gay movement. And side Y is a new one on me. But
right.
I will say my position is, at this point, I was part of Bridges Across for many years. My feeling at this point is it may be time to retire the sides, because I'm worried that the terminology is now a hindrance to understanding each other, because the terms mean different things to different people, rather than what it was originally intended to be, which was a help. So with people that I know we share an agreement on what the terms mean, I'll still use them sometimes, but I'm trying to more and more get away from them, because, you know, it's sort of like when someone starts using the abbreviations or terms that are common to their industry and you're not part of their industry, and they think you know what they're talking about and you've got no clue. I'm afraid
Right.
we do that to people too often when we start saying A, B, X, Y, C, D, E, F. You know, it's a bit much, as my view.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Any thoughts on that, Greg? Time to retire the sides? I don't know. What do you think about all of that?
I mean, I uh one of the fun things about studying the history of words at times is seeing just how little control individual people have over what happens to language, right? So like it's interesting hearing Justin tell the story and like feeling your pain so much of like, oh, these words have gone in places that like when you helped popularize them you did not intend. I'm so ambivalent about them. Like there are times when I find them useful, and I also share a lot of Justin's frustrations. And honestly, like I share one of the things that's weird about the ways the terms have proliferated to me, like the way B sort of expanded from what was originally B into like the sub parsing of B and X and Y. Um, it feels almost deceptive to me that there hasn't been a similar parsing of side A, because I think when I interact with people who
Yeah.
share the view that Jesus might potentially affirm same-sex marriage for some people at some times, I see so much differentiation between them, and the notion that they all only get one side together, and those of us who hold the historically Christian view need to be like subparsed into multiple sides. It just seems to miss some of the complexities that can exist on the same-sex marriage affirming side of the conversation. At the same time that being on sides at all maybe distracts us from the things that all of us can celebrate in various ways about what we share in common. Like on so many levels with both of you lovely gentlemen, you know, I would rather have much of our conversation be dedicated to things that don't involve being alphabetically on different sides of the alphabet.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Well,
I
maybe within side A differentiation there is, though. I don't know. Like, cause like I am like kind of sheepishly side A, but very conservative in that respect, you know, and then there's other you know, perspectives around what relationships can look like as well. So what were you gonna say,
many
Justin?
well, to that point, many years ago, when X, the side X terminology was first starting to appear, I did propose a similar kind of parsing of side A, and it just never took. And I sort of feel like, you know, it's like I said, it's just you end up in alphabet soup before long. But
Yeah.
I wanted to agree with Greg's point about specifically calling them sides within the context of a group whose whole existence was we are acknowledging that we disagree on something is something really important, but our whole reason for being here is to show grace to each other. Within that context, talking about sides was helpful. Outside of that context, I worry that when we talk about sides, we do end up maybe without meaning to drawing lines more at a time
Yes.
when I think that we do need to be acknowledging the disagreements, but in a way that like we're not on different sides, we're on the same side in the sense of we want to get this right. Those of us who are Christians, we want to please God. We want to understand what Scripture says. We may
Mhm.
disagree on what some of the answers are, but hopefully we're all trying to get it right. And so in that sense, I think we're on the same side.
Yeah. I remember in our planning too, you had said something because I sort of lean towards, you know, why do we even need language that separates us, you know, so almost like, you know, saying that the sides are, you know, bad language or something. But you had brought out a value in that people deserve safe spaces and community with like-minded folks, right? And so if you are someone that is of a side B perspective, you want to surround yourself with folks, not just that all just believe what you do, but you can share in common struggles and support to live out your life and convictions together in like-minded community, right? And then maybe generally speaking in your life, you don't need to always hang out with people that all think the same way, but there's a real value in, you know, having a safe community of like-minded people theologically on this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's talk about stealing the title of your book, but I'm going to make Greg respond to the question first. Talking across the divide, maybe the antithesis of the goodness of these side languages, right? Is the division that's created. And most folks on this call, I would imagine, have people in their life with very different perspectives on side A or side B, or even just the Christian response to LGBTQ plus people in general, right? How do we talk across cultural divides more productively? Why does it matter? What's at stake if we don't? Thoughts about that, Greg? Big question.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you've asked me to share on the contents of Justin's book, where I feel like I'm the most qualified person on the call to offer those insights.
But as he said before, let's not credit him with the concept. Just the popularization of it. Yeah.
I'm going to be taking notes, Greg.
Oh, excellent. I'll offer this sort of brief like theoretical thought first. So the guy I wrote my dissertation on is a guy named Kenneth Burke. And one of Burke's big ideas that he was really obsessed with is that like effective communication is all about identification, and identification is all about like being able to recognize some kind of sameness in the other, and to say like, oh, you and I are the same in this way. And because of that identification, we can then find some kind of common ground that makes us feel like we're able to communicate with one another. And I think when it comes to talking across divides, I mean, what we lose when we don't talk across divides is humankind. Like, we lose the fact of like the diversity of our creation. We lose the fact that we all share a planet together. For those of us who are all seeking to follow Jesus, we lose the reality that we're coming to the same God with some very different predispositions, and reaching some different answers in ways that I think we can see a lot of benefit in learning from one another, even without sort of throwing up our hands and being like, everybody's a little bit right. Like, I don't think we have to get rid of the idea that there can be right and wrong answers to certain questions, to still think that it's really important to learn from people who are coming to God with different sets of experiences, different predispositions, and pursuing the same Jesus. I think most of all, I think for those of us who are followers of Jesus, it seems to me notable that the last fervent prayer of Jesus in the garden before his crucifixion is for his followers to be unified. And so I think if any of us, for any reason, choose to be like, unity is too difficult, and just kind of like abandon the effort, it seems, I don't know, it seems a bit rude to a Jesus who is like, unity is really important, now I'm going to go die for you, to be like, yeah, this unity thing just feels a touch inconvenient for me. I don't like being in the same room with people who disagree with me. And so I think to the degree that in healthy and thoughtful and intellectually honest ways, we can get in the same room and have a conversation, and most of all, like, seek to identify, right, to find things that we can say, oh, you and I share this in common, and because we share it in common, we can have fruitful communication on the subject. I don't see a way that we can act like followers of Jesus without it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And just the posture of being curious, and respectful of differences, as well as curious about what we have in common. Kind of a strange question. Maybe it's just for my own benefit, but I've always I've misunderstood the word unity. When I think unity, I think of thinking the same way, but that's not what unity means, right? What does unity mean? The question.
This was an opportunity for a definite. Oh, well,
I mean, you're like a scholar in like English, man. Like I'm sorry but like unity means like unity in this
comes to us from the Latin. It does, in fact. But yeah, I mean, the idea of something being one. I mean, for those of you who speak bad Spanish that you learned in middle school, right? The number one, uno, it also comes to us from the same Latin root. And And so unity is about oneness. And you know, that has expressed itself in a lot of ways. Like the word unity has been defined in a lot of ways. But when we think scripturally about the way the concept of unity is introduced, the most significant scriptural metaphor for unity is the metaphor of the body, which is precisely designed for the purpose of differentiation, such that the things working together as one, as unified, as uno, happens best precisely because of the difference. And so I think that's deeply significant. And hear me, I mean, on cases of theological disagreement like this one, I know there are some people who would make this argument. I'm not making the argument that like, oh, it's just we should all have different views on, you know, what God's best for human sexuality is. Like, I'm going to take the deeply conservative view that there actually is a right answer here. And I think it'd be great if everybody agreed with me. Isn't that the nature of having an opinion, right? Don't we generally want people to agree with us? But I think to recognize that even apart from specific theological answers that we arrive at, there are certainly going to be types of callings and types of giftings that differ from person to person. Again, related to the ways Jesus has shaped each of us individually, related to the context we find ourselves in, the experiences we bring. And those things also factor into where we land theologically. And so even though theologically, I would love for us to agree with each other, on the body level, I don't want to blame the toe for having toe-like theological view. You know, I just want to recognize like the body is meant to be gloriously diverse, and that's not a threat to its unity. That's an advantage to its unity.
That was probably a very self-serving question. I hope it serves somebody other than me, but the body metaphor really works for me. So thank you very much. That was really beautiful. Justin, your thoughts. Why did you write the book? You know, what was the main catalyst or impetus to want to dive into talking across cultural divides? And, you know, when did you write it? Why did you write it? And what was kind of the impetus behind it?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I could, if I get into all that, I'm afraid I'll derail our important conversation here. But
okay.
essentially, you know, I mean, I completely agree with what Greg just said a moment ago, which is that I believe that on some issues, including our theological views, there are right and wrong answers. And I think too often we get the message in our culture that either everyone's opinion on an issue is equally valid and there's no right and no wrong, or that there is a right and wrong, and therefore what we all need to do is know what's right and then go like bulldoze over or go to war with the people who are wrong, you know? And I think that we as Christians are called to something that's neither of those. We're called to say that there are many issues on which there is a right or wrong answer. Something is true or it's not true. Something is moral or it's immoral. And it's not always the case. I often make the point, you know, when I speak to audiences about this, I say, you know, if we ask, you know, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? You know, what's the best flavor of ice cream? Everyone's opinion in that case is equally valid, unless you choose butter pecan, in which case you're going to hell. But you know, many of the issues that we disagree on, there is a right or a wrong. So we can't all be right. However, we can say that, and Greg and I can both say, I think there's a right and a wrong answer to this, and we can each have a different view of what the right answer is, and each say, no, you're wrong, you know, and say, and honestly believe that, and still at the same time see each other as part of the same body, and I meant this when I said this a moment ago, on the same side. Because I think about this like, if you are on a team of people and you are brainstorming solutions to a problem, not every solution that someone comes up with is going to be a good solution. Some of them are going to be solutions that if you tried them out, they wouldn't work, or they wouldn't work well. But you're all on the same team, not planting your flag in the ground and saying my solution or no solution. You're all working together to try and figure out what's the best solution, because you all care about solving the problem. And that's how I look at this, that Greg and I, we may have some different beliefs, but at the end of the day, we both want to get it right. We both want to please God. We both want to live holy lives. And it may be that never on this side of heaven do we come to agreement on what that looks like, but we can still respect and care about each other's attempts to do that. And
Yes.
Greg can say to me, I think you've got this wrong. I don't think you're doing the right things, but I acknowledge that you want to. I acknowledge that you love God. I acknowledge that you're trying to get it right. And I know I'm not perfect either, because we're all sinners. And so let's just be on this journey together as friends, as brothers in Christ, who are trying, as imperfect as we are, to get it right.
Yes.
That's how we get on the same side. And
Yep.
and I think the one of the things I want to say about this is, I think that these days we live in this culture. Oh my gosh, I could do a soapbox about this and I won't, but we live in a culture where social media is dividing us. The algorithms that are run by AI, that has been taught to show us what we want to see and keep us on the platform as much as possible, has learned that how it keeps us engaged as much as possible is by um, is by showing us stuff that makes us afraid or makes us angry. And so it's constantly telling us the people who disagree with you, the people who are different from you, they're evil and they're coming for you and you need to fight them and whatever. And this keeps us engaged on these platforms. We need the church now more than ever to come in and take a different approach. And I believe with all my heart that if I believe something is true, I don't help my cause by letting algorithms or my own desires put me in a place where I'm in an echo chamber where I'm only hearing from people who agree with me. If I really believe that what I believe is true, I need to put myself in a position where my beliefs can be tested, where I can hear the objections of people who disagree with me. Because if my views can withstand that, they're going to be stronger. But in the meantime, I may learn that some of my arguments aren't as good as I thought that they were, or they're things I'd overlooked. And if I've got some stuff wrong, I want that to be challenged. I want that to be corrected so I can get it right. And so I think we are better and stronger when we continually engage with each other. And we can do that not just by debating all the time, but by being friends and spending time in each other's presence and loving each other.
Absolutely. And it's like, where will we spend our time in that, community mindset? Is it fighting for the right answers, or is it something else? Right. Because we can do stuff together, even if we come to different conclusions. I'd love to
another thing on there, Brian.
Yeah, go for it.
A phrase that comes up a lot in this conversation is the idea of agreeing to disagree. And I just want to name that. I think it's a bit of a specious phrase. Like, I think it's a bit, it tricks us a bit, because it puts us into the mindset that suggests that we have some power to decide whether or not other people have permission to agree with us or to disagree with us. Right. Like, I have to agree, like, okay, Justin, you're allowed to disagree with me. When the reality is, like, Justin never asked my permission. Like, Justin doesn't want my permission to disagree. And so the question we get to answer is not, is somebody else allowed to disagree with me? The question is, what do I do when people already do disagree with me? They say they're seeking to follow Jesus and I'm seeking to follow Jesus. What do I do about it? It's not like, do I decide that this is okay? Maybe if we put ourselves in the mindset of trying to figure out which ones are okay and which ones are not, we'll distract ourselves from the actual mission, which is in figuring out what it looks like to keep seeking Jesus for ourselves and keep nudging other people in the direction of Jesus, when invariably we will have different visions about what that looks like at times.
Yeah, that's great. Love it. I'd be remiss if we got out of this call without featuring, we were planning, what can it look like for folks with different theologies to do teamwork, maybe it just looks as simple as getting on this call and that we actually like each other. I don't know. But I have a friend of mine on the call who I actually texted this morning, said, would you be willing to let us take you off mute and talk about something? So let me set it up. Kelly, if you could go find Bill for me and let me set it up a little bit.
I think I'm
I was
here.
going to, hey, good. I was going to talk about the Unconditional Conference that Jess and I were a part of, but you can go read the headlines on that one. But 1 month after that crazy mega church, fiasco that was glorious, 1 month later, out in California, there was a fishbowl dialogue where there was a panel of side A and side B Christians modeling respect, discussing shared convictions about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to care for the LGBTQ plus community. And, and it was hosted by a conservative church and a progressive church, and a bunch of people showed up, and it was just such and probably in the follow-up email, if you don't mind, Bill, I'll send along the blog that tells the story. But I just thought it was just such a beautiful model of what it looks like to do this type of work together with different perspectives. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, a couple of groups that I'm a part of put this on, and honestly, it was a ton of fun. I mean, so there were 6 panelists, 3 more conservative, 3 more progressive. But I mean, the truth is there are a couple kind of who, like, one's like I don't have a side, and just some really good folks were involved. And what was interesting, people showed up, and I had a couple of people saying, man, this is going to be a great cat fight.
I know, they probably assumed they were like showing up for
Oh yeah, there was just going to be a brawl. And what happened was, people were so confused because they're looking at their little pamphlet with a brief bio of each person. And so this guy Barack, he starts sharing, and he's gay, affirming, and he's married to a woman. And everyone's like, oh, hold on, I thought he was on my team, And then he says all these, and he's an affirming guy, and he's like super affirming, and he's kind of going to bat. This one guy who's a celibate, this Latino guy who kind of from a conservative church background, sharing, yeah, this was a real challenge. And Barack's like, oh man, that's so hard. How can we support you? And then this woman, Janelle, who I think you probably know, Greg, Janelle, who's side B, I guess. She works with Revoice, which is a great organization.
Oh, I do know Janelle. How delightful.
Yeah, she's just a great human. And she's like going to town advocating for this trans woman and her experiences in the church. And then she's talking about supporting her friends who are gay and married. And everyone's looking at their bulletin going like, hold on, I thought she was on my side. Yeah, and people just were so confused. And what it was these LGBT Christians who are just loving each other really well. And yeah, they've got some disagreements, and they pointed out some of those here and there, but in a very respectful, kind way. But mostly it was about, hey, how does the church create space for people to have experiences of love and belonging and honoring radical discipleship, right? And not dismissing other people's views of scripture. And it was just, there were 250 people there, and it was so fun. Some of the more conservative people were angry because they're like, why didn't we push our, the definition of marriage between a man and a woman? And some of the more aggressive, affirming people were a little angry, like, well, why did you give so much time for the conservatives to say? But so take out 10 people on either side, and you've got 230 people who are just curious and like, wow, this is really fun.
Maybe we can do this different.
Maybe we could do it different. So it was really delightful.
I love that. Really good.
Yeah, if you want me to say something else, I can. But I mean, that was
no.
That's all there is. It was just great.
It's good. Great. It just seemed like such a simple example. I love that. Hey, Kelly, do you have an especially good question out of the chat here?
Yeah, I actually have a couple. I'm gonna start with I think this one was just came up. It says, have the different sides in quotes in this discussion made it difficult for you guys to find faith community? And for those of us who want to see the church more welcoming to LGBTQ plus people, how important is it that we take a side? So that's one question, and then I have another.
I can speak for myself that I've been fortunate to be able to find faith communities both when I was of a side B persuasion and many years where I was lost in the middle, not sure, and then got married. So I guess I'm side A. You have to be pretty intentional about it. And I did, I sort of like being in communities where I can help move the needle, and so I've not had a hard time, finding community based on, it's tricky though, because sometimes I feel like my experience with the church has been really good. Like I kind of experienced church the way it could or should be. Like I could be unsure about my sexuality and all of that stuff, and I got good support. But I think I'm maybe in the minority amongst my LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters. So sometimes I don't encourage folks to hang out in a church that maybe can't fully affirm where they're at, side A or side B, because they don't want to have more harm or whatever. But that's just been my experience. How about you, Greg and Justin, as far as like church communities?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I've only had to find one church since coming out, because I was in a church. I was leading worship when I came out, and I came out with my book, which is a terrible way to come out. I just took the pre-order link and put it on Facebook and was like, "Dear friends,
That's
I have a
right.
book coming out. Also, other things you should know."
Single, gay, and Christian,
Yeah,
just in
yeah, a
case you're
title
not
which
sure what
leaves
it's
so little
about.
to the imagination. So I mean, that was complicated in its own way. And there were some people who left the church over that, but then so many people who sort of beautifully came alongside me. And then the church I'm part of now is a church plant that started basically right as I was coming to Boise. So I've had the privilege of being part of how that identity has taken shape over time. I think, I mean, part of the question was like,
Does a
do we
church
have to
need
take
to
a
pick
side?
a side?
And in my experience, the problem, what I sometimes experience from people who are not taking sides is that not taking sides is sort of the functional equivalent of not talking about it. And I think not talking about it is a practice shared by a lot of people with a lot of different views, which puts so much of the burden on the LGBTQ person waltzing into a church community being like, look, I realize I didn't get a forehead tattoo with my sexuality on it, but I'd really love to know something about this community's approach relatively soon before I like pour hours and months and years of my life into you, only to realize that this is actually not going to be a great long-term fit for me. And so I think
So that
what I've experienced is that where there's no conversation, the burden falls on the LGBTQ person. And so I would advocate for a church to have some kind of meaningful conversation about it, so that the person approaching, especially from the outside, or the person struggling from the inside, has a sense of what they'll experience. Because I think, unpredictability is so much worse than like predictable meanness. Like I would much rather go in being like, these people will hate my guts, than go in being like, they might like me, and then have them hate my guts.
I'll echo that. I think so I've really struggled in a lot of places where I've lived to find solid Christian community. And I hear from lots and lots of people from all around the world who are really struggling. People on, I'm going to have to use the side terms again, but on both side A and side B. And what I hear is a couple of things. One of which is what Greg just said, that churches that are trying to not take a position often are just not having the conversation. And so there's this sense of, if you've ever been in a space where there's the elephant in the room, that there's something that people aren't talking about, and you don't feel comfortable talking about it because it's like, if someone brings it up, who knows what's going to happen? It can feel that way to a lot of people. And when the thing we're talking about is not an issue, but is in fact your life and what you're wrestling with in your whole life, that is just untenable for deep, connected Christian community. But I also hear a lot about the opposite problem, where you have churches and Christian communities on both sides that have sort of planted their flag, drawn the line in the sand, and their approach to the conversation is that kind of cultural polarization approach. It's the us versus them. Here's who we are, and the other side is the enemy. And that's not particularly helpful, even if you agree with them. It's not particularly helpful to folks who are trying to figure out how to follow Christ with what can be some really challenging questions. For me, saying that I'm gay and saying that I'm married, that's not a political statement. And I find that many churches that I've been to that would affirm me as a married gay man want to take that in a whole kind of direction that I don't want to take that. That is one piece of me, but it's not. I don't want my church time to be like activist time. I want to be sitting at the feet of Jesus, And likewise, I've gone to many churches that are side B churches where I say, look, I know we disagree on this, but I'm not even going to bring it up. I just want you to know this is who I am. But let's just sit at the feet of Jesus and learn together. But where it's constantly people wanting to sit down and say, we need to talk about, or sermons about the evils of homosexuality and the evils of the LGBTQ community and all this stuff. None of that's helpful. So I think we really need more Christian spaces where people have the freedom to be on a journey, and where what we care about is something that was mentioned just a minute ago, caring for each other. I can be on the other side of this from somebody and still be focused on what's going on in their life and how can I care for them and how can we as a community care for them. That's what Jesus did.
Yep. Love it. So good. Kelly, you got another one for us?
I do. This is another two-parter. It says, how do we champion unity over uniformity when it comes to this issue in the church? And how does that play out practically?
I'll just continue with what I was just saying. Like I think if we care for each other, I always encourage people on any difficult issue, and this is a great one, to listen and share stories with each other. So often what we do when we know there's a disagreement is we focus on preaching. We focus on making sure we know what the right position is and then figuring out what arguments we need to make to convince the other person. And I don't think that's particularly helpful on any issue, and especially not in a Christian context. So what I encourage people to do instead is spend more time listening to each other and hearing their stories. My view is if even Jesus took the time to sit down with people and hear their stories that he, probably already knew, then surely we should. And when we hear people's stories, we come to appreciate, in spite of the disagreements we may have, all of the experiences and concerns in their life that have led them to their position. And we can honor those even if we disagree with the position.
When I think about the difference between unity and uniformity, I'm reminded of an image and a concept that comes up in missiology circles. So like the study of how missions work is done, which is the idea of a centered set and a bounded set. And a centered set is people all pointed inward toward a thing that is defined by what is in the center. And a bounded set is a community defined by having drawn a line and said, everybody who's on this side of the line is with us and everybody who's on this side of the line is with them. And so I think when I think of uniformity, I think of trying to get people inside the line, right? Trying to draw the line and say like, okay, we need to be so focused on where the line is and who's in and who's out. And when I think of unity, I primarily think of being a community of people whose primary focus is on the person of Jesus in the middle, and saying like the goal is to all be pointed in that direction, and being much more interested in the direction that we're pointed than which line we find ourselves on one side or the other of. And And I think when I think about what that looks like practically, like to see that played out in community, I'm reminded of how I think a lot of the most fruitful conversations that I have with folks who are, for the purposes of today's side conversation, side A, many of the most fruitful conversations I have with those folks have to do with the question of the amount of authority that we want Jesus to have in our lives. Like the amount of permission that hopefully all of us, regardless of our theological convictions on this particular question, want to be able to say to Jesus, like, you're allowed to tell me all the things, including the things I don't want you to tell me, right? You're allowed to ask of me the things that I would prefer that you not ask of me. And that question of discipleship and of costly discipleship in the Bonhoefferian sense of the word, right? The idea that discipleship should be allowed to call us to something costly, I hope, is the kind of deeply and universally Christian theme that can transcend a lot of our theological particulars and become the focus of a conversation in which Jesus is that center of the set that all of us are pointed toward. And I think to the degree that we can point our practice of discipleship and of Christian community around those kinds of questions, we'll be much better suited to find ways to come alongside and encourage one another, even across really notable disagreement.
I love that. Bonhoefferian? Did you just make that word up?
I got you, just so you know, Greg. Bonhoeffer, right?
Thank you, Kelly.
I know.
Yes.
Oh, Bonhoeffer. Got it. Okay. Oh, anyways.
Yeah,
It's fun trying to keep up with your brain, Greg.
We do have one more question that came in.
Yes, please, Kelly.
Okay, it says, what is the biggest lesson you've learned when it comes to God and faith as someone who is gay? So, like, what is one of the biggest takeaways you've learned as a gay person, as it relates to your faith in God?
I can start. I don't know if it's the biggest one, but it's the first one I think of. I spent most of my life believing that the best way to honor God was to not act on it, right? To repair it, to what have you. And then I had a reasonable amount of wrestling at a crossroads with God, and I came out the other end going, you know what? I think it's okay. I think it's okay, and I'm not sure, but I think God's got me, and He's got me covered, even if I've got this thing wrong, right? And I went in a new direction, and it was an option for me to have same-sex relationships, and lo and behold, I have an amazing husband today. I'm still not sure if I got this right, but I've learned on the other side of that crossroads, if you will, that faith is not at all about certainty. It's about trusting that God's got me, even if I've got this wrong. And I remember up to that point of that crossroads, that it just felt way too risky to get this thing wrong. And now what I've learned about God, I've kind of taken a risk on something that I wasn't sure about, but basically made a decision that it wasn't a sustainable, healthy life for me anymore, that God's got me. And so that's the biggest thing I've learned, is that God's sufficiency of His grace is more sure than it ever was before. That's my best one.
I think for me, one of the key things I've learned is the depth of my belovedness, and not just mine, the belovedness of humankind broadly, and also like us as human individuals. How deeply, how vastly, how fully we are beloved. And I think sometimes I say that and people are like, well, but if you really thought you were beloved, Coles, then you would truly love that gay part of you, and then you'd be free to... And honestly, I mean, that gets us into, we don't have time. The evening is late. But I think actually for me, it's actually been so much in singleness and in celibacy that I've come to see that the things that make celibacy not just livable but beautiful also have so much to do with the recognition of our belovedness.
Mm.
That's why it can be good and beautiful to live a life that's ordered around having fallen in love with a 2,000-year-old Jewish dude, precisely because he is the sort of lover who is so perfectly gifted to love us well. Yeah,
I love that.
Mm.
Hmm.
The first thing that came to my mind was somewhat similar to yours, Brian, but a little different. Um, and this is going to sound like this is going to sound like it's a plug for the new edition of my book, and I promise I don't mean it that way.
It's okay.
But it is the subject. It is the subject of one of the new chapters in the new in the new edition of Torn. But and so that's probably why I've been thinking about it a lot. When I was growing up, I had this sense that the strongest Christians were the ones who were the most certain about everything. I wanted to grow up to be the kind of Christian who you could ask any moral question of, any spiritual, theological question of, and I would know right away the answer and could cite chapter and verse to prove it. Because I knew people I saw that way, and they seemed so certain. And in my mind, that certainty equated to wisdom. And that's the kind of Christian I wanted to be. When I realized I was gay and then went on this long journey where after growing up feeling like I was such a good Christian and, was surrounded by good Christians, where suddenly I was the outcast and suddenly I was the one who was on the receiving end of preaching. And suddenly I went from being the golden boy to being the one that people didn't want their kids to hang out with. It was a really painful journey, but one of the many things it taught me was how much I didn't know and how important it was to have the humility to admit that you don't know it all. And so I've kind of at this stage of my life now gone back to something that was on my fourth grade teacher's wall. He had this poster that said, "The more you know, the more you know that you don't know." And I didn't really fully grasp that as a fourth grader, but it stuck in my head. And now, as a Christian, at this age, I feel like, man, this is something I wish I'd understood when I was much younger. That wisdom and being a strong Christian is not always about having all the answers, although I think as we grow as Christians, we do gain wisdom and learn more and have more certainty about certain things. But it's often about realizing that there's always going to be stuff we don't know, that we're always going to get stuff wrong. And so we do the best we can. We pray, we trust Christ, we try to get it right. But then we have to lean on God to make up all of the rest of it, because we can't get there on our own. And that ought to affect how we respond to people we disagree with and people who are in different places and people who rub us the wrong way. That ought to change everything.
It's good. What a great question and couple answers to end on. Thank you guys so much. Our time has come. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Justin. This was a glorious conversation. I hope it's served all of you. I will make sure I have some ideas of what resources I'm going to send out to everybody post call here, such as featuring a couple of your books, maybe the article on that fishbowl panel that Bill was talking about, real beautiful story after, but I'll check in with you and the rest of you. You get a follow-up email in the next day or so with some follow-up resources and a recording of this discussion. But thank you both again. Pleasure having you.
Oh, it's been a delight. Thanks for hosting us, Brian.
Thank
Absolutely.
you so much.
And thank you everybody else. Thanks for hanging in with us. Hope we served you well. Have a good night.